Welcome to the Emerging Biotech Leader, where we help biotech leaders maximize the value of their therapeutics from translational development to product launch. We're your hosts. I'm Kim Kushner.
And I'm Ramin, Farhood. We are here to help you navigate the pitfalls of the biotech industry and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome to today's episode of the Emerging Biotech Leader. Today, we're so glad to welcome Dr. Keith Gottesdiener, the president and CEO of Prime Medicine, who's going to share some really great insights with us about what it takes to start as a physician and move into not only being an entrepreneur, but an innovator, a founder, CEO, president of a number of different organizations throughout his career. We'll talk a lot about innovation in big pharma, entrepreneurship, and how to make the leap, and what it's like to start a company during COVID and what made it really different from prior pursuits. Keith, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
To start us off, maybe we can start at the beginning and early on in your career. We've had the opportunity to learn you were a practicing physician, maybe weren't getting the fulfillment that you were looking for out of your career and really were looking for something bigger. So can you tell us a little bit about how you decided that it was time to move into industry and make a change and what you were looking for versus what you found when you got there?
So in practice, I was both a practicing physician and a research scientist. So I was on the faculty. I did quite a bit of training, as people do, to become a physician. I was a specialist in infectious diseases, but I also spent a great deal of time in the laboratory, first at Harvard, and then became a professor at Columbia, where I did research and I saw patients. And I did that, I think, in total for about 8 years. But it really wasn't the right choice for me, even though I really liked taking care of patients. I think I became a fairly decent doctor, actually, during that time. And I think I even became a very decent researcher as well. But, you know, academic life has a rhythm to it that really wasn't suited to me. It's kind of a very slow, very deliberate pace. And I just found myself a little frustrated at the pace of which things were happening. I found that the questions I was dealing with research were very narrow, and the same thing was true to some degree with patients. Again, it was a slice of life as opposed to all of life when one was looking at that. And so I just really felt that for my areas of interest, what I thought I might be good at, staying in the academic center wasn't really quite well for me. Merck Research Labs came to me around 1994, 1995, and they had a very interesting proposition for me. They had just sort of discovered the idea that translational medicine, taking things out of the laboratory, bringing them into people, was an art, not just, a simple step. And so at that point, and of course I'm simplifying things that were much more complicated than I'm sort of saying today, they basically had labs come up with ideas, and when they thought they were ready, they joked, they threw them over the wall to the clinical team who caught them. And often they looked at it and they said, what was it these folks sent to me? It's not ready. It's missing pieces. It's diseases we're not interested in. So Merck decided they wanted people who had one foot in each side of that divide, really good physicians, people who understood science, who could really sort of straddle that boundary. So I came to Merck at a perfect time, for someone with my area and expertise, and joined the group that really did all of that early development. And that job, which I did for about 8 years at Merck, was just an incredible job. That group really took things out of the laboratory, the year or two process where you really go from an idea into something that becomes a therapeutic, testing the toxicology, where does it distribute in the body? And then also took it into the first experiments. Really, that's what we call early trials. They really are experiments because you don't really know what's going to happen in those trials, whether things are going to work or they're not, or potentially even they may not be safe overall. So we would carry them forward until the point where we could tell Merck, the company, this is working or this is not working. And for me, it was just a wonderful place to be. It had a tremendous amount of breadth. The pace was extraordinarily fast. I was disappointed about the pace in academics. I learned that in industry, anything I thought about the pace, I was really underestimating. The good news is I caught up pretty quickly, but it took a little while to realize that when they said we really want an answer next Monday, they really weren't kidding. Next Monday is what it was. When you were writing grants in academics, you would try to pick which half of a year you were going to finish that grant. And so it was a very different time frame, as you could see. And it was a wonderful place to be. And Merck at that point, as with many pharmas, was really going through just a burst of innovation. They were trying new ways of doing things. The genetic data that was coming out of things like sequencing the human genome was just starting to appear. There were new modalities. Antibodies were starting to be able to be developed more rapidly. New instruments that let you look into the body a little more so, like mass spectrometers, were just being put into use. There was all this wonderful stuff that people had to work out, and it was just an incredibly innovative time. And during those 8 years, I think each year I probably saw 20 or so. That may be a little bit of an exaggeration. New ideas that went into the clinic for Merck. So it was a chance to really watch all sorts of wonderful hypotheses about what could make sense. And frankly, out of that came 8 or 10 great drugs that Merck then brought forward into later stage trials. So I really felt like I was at the right spot. I had come to that job a little later in my career. So I was already an associate professor, 10 years by that point out of my training. They gave me an entry level job because they said none of that really counted for Merck, all that financial, all that academic stuff that you have to do was irrelevant to them. But it turned out that wasn't really true because grants are very similar to the kinds of position papers you actually give to pharma. The presentations to senior leadership look awful like presentations at major meetings. The net result of it was, I was able to get to a very high position of leadership very, very quickly. And I love that. 8 years into that, Merck decided I better learn something new. That was a little unusual for Merck to do that, but someone took a chance and they made me head of late development there. And eventually I was co-head of late development. So that was really getting all those trials past the FDA, all those big phase 3 trials, et cetera. So I got a chance to really see all parts of the drug development area. And frankly, it was a wonderful experience, which is generally not duplicated in pharma today, where people tend to specialize in narrow slices. And Merck had a very nice policy. They said to me, "You're an infectious disease doc. We don't want you to do any infectious disease programs. You have to learn about drug development. And if we put you in an infectious disease program, you're going to feel really comfortable because you know the area. We're going to give you an obesity program for your first program." And what I knew about obesity was pretty close to zero. It's a risky approach because all that expertise I had in infectious diseases didn't come back until much later. But it's a great way to train great developmental scientists in there as well. And I love the place at Merck, and frankly, it was one of the highlights of my life.
Keith, would that be something that you would recommend, that especially for physicians that have a specialty in one area, and keep an open mind, even if the work or the job is not necessarily in that particular therapeutic area, it's an opportunity for learning and maybe growing your knowledge base?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things you have to do in the course of your career is you have to put yourself into situations where you don't feel comfortable. If every step is just a teeny incremental one of where you are, and so you're doing 90% of the old stuff and 10% of the new stuff, you can make a career out of that, and it can be a very fulfilling career, but it definitely isn't the career I'd be recommending to people who have a little pizzazz. You really should put yourself into positions that really stretch you in some way. And so that's just one of the ways you can stress yourself, but I think it's a really important one. To have a cardiologist opine about how to treat AIDS and develop an AIDS, program meant they really had to work hard to do that. They had to learn all sorts of things they had just never done before. And frankly, they came out of it much better people, much better doctors, actually, in many cases. But more importantly is they really were on their way to developing therapeutics because they got to focus on that special part that isn't the research, isn't the clinical, but it's the drug development part, which is, frankly, I used to joke, there are 3 legs to the stool, and people come in very good at 2 of them. But if you don't learn the third one, that stool is never going to stand upright. Now, that's a silly little,
Right. No, it definitely makes sense. How did you make a decision to go from 16 years from Merck, being from all the way in all the different phases, right, in drug development, from translational medicine all the way to clinical development and approval, to become the first CEO job at Rhythm Pharmaceuticals. That seems to be a big jump.
It really was a big jump. So first of all, Merck was changing a little bit. So, essentially you get a couple kicks that make you stop for a minute and say, is life as pleasant as you think? I think for many years it was. By the time, 16 years was up, I would probably say it took a couple little hard knocks, things Merck was doing, ways they were rearranging, some of the decisions about where they were prioritizing. Those are things that make you sit up for the first time and say, maybe this isn't quite as heavenly as one might look. But I think also was the realization that as you move up in an organization, the problems and the things you deal with really start to change. So by the time I left, when I was co-leading, late development, to all intents and purposes, there were something like, I don't know, again, I'm guessing 1,000, 1,500 people who reported to me. And all those people were problem solvers. So the only problems I got to see were all those horrible problems that 1,500 people had really worked on and they had never solved it, and they came to me. And I have to tell you, those were not the fun problems. Those were things like, we're all fighting about a new, standard operating procedure because there's, some politics around how we're going to do this. And we need someone to really look into it and to do this. Or, really, who should get those 10 new hiring slots to spread out?
Resourcing, budget, and right.
You got it. And, I got to tell you, that isn't me. So I did it for a lot of years. I was pretty decent at it. But, my wife, who's an incredibly smart woman, just started telling me, you're coming home, for 15, 14 years, you came home really happy every day. And now you're coming home really unhappy, nervous, frazzled, frustrated. You really should think about something else. Now, exactly what else to do was a very, very hard decision, because one choice would be to go to another organization with a slightly different job, and maybe some of those things would have been better. And I actually looked at it. But my family was a family of entrepreneurs, small businessmen, people who founded company, were very, very active in things. I joke that my dad was probably the only Jewish father who really cried when his son became a doctor, because he really felt like, from business point of view, which is what he was, doctors were essentially not particularly good at business. And he thought I had the makings of this. And I have to say, he was quite old when I finally left Merck, but he was quite pleased that I decided to go back to a little bit more of a business approach. And I found that entrepreneurship was something I really wanted to do. That ability to pick a group of people you wanted to work with, to take an idea and really make it your own, and understand that you and you alone. Now, of course, that's not quite true, because it's always the team that works with you. But that's how I started my thinking. You and you alone can really create something, and it's all going to be in your hands. If it works, it's you. And if it doesn't work, you got to own it and you got to move forward. And I found that just so much appealed to me to make that choice, that I just wanted to do it very, very badly. Now, in 2010 and 11, which is when I was looking, it was a very bad time for biotech. There weren't a lot of biotechs being formed, and actually finding a job in biotech was extremely difficult. And because of what I just mentioned, I really wanted to be a CEO, really someone who led that company. And I'll be honest with you, my abilities didn't match the job description of what they wanted in a CEO. I knew almost nothing of what a CEO did. I just knew they ran the company. So I didn't understand boards. I didn't understand fundraising. I didn't understand how to build a company. To this day, I'm amazed that someone gave me the chance to be a CEO. And I'm eternally thankful that the folks at Rhythm who hired me really early in the company really made that decision. And I got to tell you, it was a real learning process to do that. But I found out that it actually was an area where I found myself just at home again, right? The decisions, the things we talked about, the problems, they were all things I really enjoyed doing. I found myself picking them up reasonably quickly, making a lot of mistakes along the way. Good news, none of them were existential for the company, though a few of them were pretty serious along the way. But, I just felt more alive than I ever had before. And we created a company that was very different over the next couple of years than the conception idea on the day I joined. And that was also something that was really exciting because biotechs thrive on the ability to really deal with reality in some ways, right? It's not like at a pharma company where you start a program and for 5 years, almost nothing can derail it because it kind of has its backers and, whatever. You know, you have to go out, you have to get money, things happen, you have to make choices. Biotech companies really have to go with the flow to some degree. And I just found that was a wonderful place to be and we could build a great company.
So that was an atypical pathway. It sounds like you left Merck to avoid the budget, the people politics, and all of that. And then you take on CEO, which is the ultimate role for budget and people politics, and arguably more politics when you add your investors and the board and all of these other dynamics. How did you balance what you didn't enjoy from the role you left to the role you did enjoy, which is really helping to build the company around you? What were the nuances, and how were you able to lean into the actual development and the pieces you liked?
Well, Kim, I'm not 100% sure I agree that I traded one set of budget and people management for another set of budget and people management. There are really substantive differences between those two. And some of it is being in a big organization versus a very small one. But some of it also sort of how the oversight works, right? Most pharma companies are very top down, very micromanaged. Let's keep an eye on everything. Pharma companies generally aren't the most trusting of people, right? They want teams to come in and report every single day. So there clearly are politics and people management that goes into biotech, but there were a couple of advantages. A board kind of looks in every 2 months or every 3 months. They can do a lot more to direct you than happens at a pharma company. But most of the time, if you have cogent ideas and you have a good board, they'll give you a little bit of freedom to move that way, and they don't really look over the shoulder, right? Second thing is as Ramin said, one of you said, I joined Rhythm at a very early space. If I didn't like the people I was working with or there were people problems, they were my problems. I hired every single one of those people.
Right.
First. And that's a wonderful place to be. You can't hide when you do that. If you make a bad choice with someone, or even if you make a good choice, but the organization moves along and that person's no longer the right person, you have to deal with it. But in many ways, you get to choose the people you're going to work with. And I think that was just a wonderful opportunity. A lot of work. Okay. You have to hire everybody. You really have to develop them. You have to bring them along in a different way than you do at a pharma company. But it just very much appealed to me to deal with those kind of groups. And frankly, those groups and the people are what make biotech companies great. And so getting the culture right, getting the people right, it probably is more important than the science.
Than anything else, right?
Yeah, it just is. If you get the wrong people and they're doing the wrong thing, the company falls apart. Doesn't matter how good the science is.
And if you have the right people, even if they are not necessarily doing the right thing, they'll figure that out, and then they'll change course and they end up doing the right thing. So it always comes down to people. I know it sounds like a cliche, but it's really that's the secret sauce. It always comes down to the people that you have on your team.
I would totally agree with that. People are really what makes a biotech great if you do things right. I think there's many different parts about that part about people. One is, of course, is just the practical issue. Biotech companies essentially are organizations of knowledge of how to do stuff. In any of my companies, if you had walked in and you had looked about what's valuable in that company, in that space, there's literally nothing there that has any value except what's in people's minds or what they put into their computers to be stored. The second thing is that you have the opportunity to form a culture or a way of doing things that will really allow a biotech to succeed. So I have some pretty strong feelings about why biotechs or what biotechs need to do to succeed. But among them, they just need to be ready to be very, very flexible in what they do. Big pharma has a lot of money. It has a lot of people, a lot of resources. So you have to ask yourself, what are biotechs that really are differentiating and really make it special? And one of them is that ability to look at data, think about things or information, look at it, think about it, put it all together. And if you have to move in a different direction, not to take weeks and months to
Right.
do that.
Right.
And
The bureaucracy is not there. Right.
exactly. And you also need people, because you don't have all the backup, who are really willing to take what they need to do on their shoulders, as you said, Ramin, and just do it, right? You can't give them huge teams of people to do it. People have to be really highly motivated to do so and really believe in what that company is doing. And if you put together that group of people, that group's going to succeed at something. It may not really be the same thing that you thought it was going to succeed at. And that is what happened at Rhythm. We ended up becoming an obesity company, but we started out as a company that was very, very different. And that's because new opportunities came and we had the right people to lead us that way.
And after 8 or 9 years, you left Rhythm right after they had approval for their indication, right? And usually, CEOs stay along longer. And I remember we were chatting offline the other day. Tell us a little bit about that, because you left Rhythm and to Prime, and we definitely want to learn more a little bit about Prime. But what was your thinking there that was the right time for you to make that move? And perhaps maybe do everything all over again from the beginning, kind of in a different therapeutic area, right?
Well, that was a little daunting. When I left thinking about what I was going to do next, I'll talk about it in a minute. It was really time for me to go at Rhythm. I'm joking, but there's a rhythm to how biotechs work, and they continue to evolve. I do think CEOs eventually get a little stale at a company over time. You've seen so many companies go up and then they've tended to come down again as well. That's a company cycle, but I think there's a similar one for CEOs. In my case, among the many reasons that that was the right time to leave was the company was leaving that clinical research arena to really become a commercial company. And I'm not someone who has either the knowledge or the experience to do that. And I had a lot of exposure to that at pharma. And it really just isn't me. Knowing how to sell your drugs is just not something that really drives my soul. It's important. And, companies do it well, and there are people who really are skilled at it, but it wasn't me. So I think it was a good time for me to step down. And I think the board and I had talked about it for a while before it actually happened. And, I think they very much agreed with me. It was the right time. As a matter of fact, they surprised me a little bit, because when I brought it up to them, I suggested, why don't we do a 6-month or period transition? And they said, no. We think it's the right time is pretty soon, like now. Okay. That wasn't my favorite minute at Rhythm, but they were absolutely right about that. If you're going to go and you're going to look for a person who's different, it is time to go. And, I stepped out, and that was in really February, March of 2020. So it wasn't the best time to be looking for a new
Right
job.
at the beginning of the COVID. I think COVID started like in March-ish of 2020, right?
March, April is when it really hit.
Right.
Well, of course, I didn't really know that when I stepped out, so I can't say that I
Nobody
did
knew
that.
that. Yeah.
No, none of us knew that as well, and those were pretty bad times. But it was the right time to go, and I knew a little more so what I wanted. I had decided I liked doing what I had done at Rhythm. I wanted to start from the beginning a new biotech. Listen, I had made a good number of mistakes or things I could have done better at Rhythm. I thought all of them through, and I said, the next time I'm just going to do a better job on this, this, and this. It's a long list. I'm a pretty humble guy, and I had a fairly long list of things I'd like to do better. But I had slightly different requirements this time. One was I really wanted to work with a board that I knew well, and I had the opportunity to do that. People who I knew and really respected and had a similar view about what the company wanted to do. Rhythm was a little more rocky in that regard. The second thing is I again wanted to be there early because I really again said I want to really create this from the beginning, or at least lead the creation. And again, I knew what had worked well before and what hadn't, and that was a great opportunity. And the third is I really wanted to do some transformational science. Rhythm wasn't a transformational company. It had some very creative ideas from it, but from the beginning, there were molecules we were working. It was creative in the sense of figuring out where they would work, but it wasn't creative in the way that a company like Prime is, which is really just opening a whole new area into something. And I said, if I'm going to go back and do it again, I really want to go back. And frankly, I was thrilled to death, and I still feel just totally thankful. The folks at Prime spoke to me and decided I was the right person to do that. And, then we've been off in the running, and it's been about 4 years now.
That's amazing. Can you tell us a little bit about the transformational science? What makes Prime so different?
Well, people have been talking for a number of years about the genetic basis of disease. Now, not all disease is directly related to your genes. Some of it are things that happen during the course of your life. You eat too much bacon and you eventually get a heart attack. I'm joking, of course, that isn't quite the way it happens, but those are a little bit more environmental or developmental kinds of things. But there are a number of diseases that really can be traced back to your genes. So people have been trying literally for decades to impact your genome in a way. And some of those early techniques, gene therapy is a good example that goes back to the 80s and 90s, okay, were areas where people took some very blunt instruments to do that. They had a way to get a copy of something, genetic information, into your body, and they hoped that if it got there, it would be expressed. In other words, it would be, it would develop in the body, and you would make the proteins that you needed and would have an impact. But a lot of those things didn't quite work that well, and some of them had some safety issues. Gene editing was a new approach that came up in the 2010s. You would probably know the first element of that, or the most commonly known, is CRISPR technology, right? And CRISPR technology was a major step forward. What CRISPR technology could do is it had a way to get to a very specific spot in the gene. That one spot out of your 3+ billion base pairs and nowhere else. That's pretty amazing when you think about it. And it can get there fast. It doesn't need to go into your body and take 10 years to find that spot. It scans your genome and it lands on that spot with very high specificity. So for the first time, we could get to a very, very specific spot and we could do something there, and you knew exactly where it was going to work. The problem is, while there are many versions of CRISPR, most of the versions didn't work out. And in the end, what CRISPR does when it gets there is it breaks your chromosome in half. And that's an emergency for your body. And so your body kind of fills that in with a whole bunch of junk and snaps the two pieces of chromosomes together. But whatever was there at that spot, for example, a gene, it's pretty much inactivated. So CRISPR really inactivates things you want inactivated. But there's only so many places where inactivating something that is toxic to you is really a curative approach. What you really want to do is be able to find places where there are problems that you want to fix. And really, prime editing is just an incredibly powerful technique that can go in, find the same way as CRISPR, that specific spot, and can make corrections. So, for example, you can go in and you can find the error in the genes of someone with Tay-Sachs. There are 2 extra base pairs, a mutation that means a gene doesn't work. We literally can take them out. Or we can go into the mutations of cystic fibrosis, and we can say there's a place where a couple of letters of the gene are missing. We can put them back in again. There are many other things we can do beyond that, but the idea that you could go into people and you can actually change their genomes and change them at the actual gene itself. So when you're done, you don't have to worry about, is that gene going to function right? Because you're fixing the gene people have the same way you and I do. So they're really taking that cystic fibrosis gene in that normal spot, and they're making an absolutely normal cystic fibrosis gene. I mean, it's just amazing. And when you look at the kinds of diseases, particularly rare diseases, so this could be used quite a bit outside of rare diseases, we literally have come up with 100 or 200 genes just in our initial work where we could theoretically go in and correct them. Now, I don't want to suggest this is all, easy. In 4 years, yeah, you have to translate something that works great in the test tube into something that's a therapeutic, right? If you can only get it to work in 1% of your cells, nothing's going to happen. If you get it to work in 80 or 90% of your cells, people are going to be cured. So you have to get it to work well. You got to make sure it is truly working at the spot you want and it's not mucking around elsewhere. And you got to get the machinery to the right cells. And that's truly still a problem today. We can get to the lung, we can get to the bone marrow, we can get to many places. But for example, today in the test tube, we could do wonderful things to brain cells. We can cure Huntington's disease or ALS in brain cells from patients. But there really aren't great ways to get that machinery to the brain at high enough levels yet to really make the corrections in a way that are going to cure people. But every year, those delivery techniques get better. Every year, the efficiency of the editing gets better. Every year, the specificity that you're only working in the right spot gets better. And actually, the FDA just gave us approval. They approved our IND for our first disease that we're treating. And so,
Congratulations.
yeah, next year we're going to have real data to show that this actually works in people the way we'd really like.
Is there a particular? It seems so. Prime editing seems to have a very broad therapeutic potential. Is there a particular area that you are focusing on, or is too soon to say?
And how are you deciding that?
Yeah, well, those are great questions. We get asked them by investors pretty much on a daily basis. When we started out, we put together a pipeline of 18 programs. Now, for a company our size, that makes no sense. 18 programs, in preclinical work, that's a Merck-sized pipeline, okay? And in fact, I tell the story, which is apocryphal, not exactly truthful, that when that happened, we picked our 18. Our chief scientific officer marched in and, screamed at me because at that point we didn't really even have 18 people, let alone, for 18 programs. It made even less sense at that point. But the reason we did that is we were trying to figure out where prime editing would work. So we picked some places where, remember I told you that getting the machinery to the right spot was more known. We picked some where that was known. We knew how to deliver the machinery. Now we had to show that we could do some of the editing. We picked another bunch that were places where we didn't know how fast we'd be able to deliver, but we thought there were great opportunities. Huntington's disease, for example. Okay. So it was kind of a broad mix of things that we were really looking at when we put it together. We also expected that in practice, because, I've been developing drugs for years and I tell this story often. Normally what happens is you start a program, a bunch of programs, half of them aren't there the next year because they run into technical problems. Doesn't mean prime editing couldn't work on them, but there were some things you had to solve first that were going to take some time. And actually, we still have the same 18 programs in our pipeline 4 years later. Nothing has dropped out. It just shows how powerful this is. But of course, that means, Kim, the question you asked, how did you choose and what are you doing now? That's why investors are asking us, because they're looking at our pipeline and saying, okay, we understand why you started with 18. We expected you'd be down to 5 by now.
Right, right.
Okay. You can't afford to do more than 5. Which of the 5 you're actually going to do? So we are focusing down a little bit more than I'd like because, frankly, all those programs look incredible, but, biotech is a little harder to raise money. These things take time. You really have to focus. And a lot of our work over the last year has been focusing on certain programs where we think we can get through to the clinic and show people it works. So once we can do that, we can continue to attract more and more capital to really help us really spread the pipeline.
Do you feel like, Keith, from a funding perspective, we are in a cycle that the funding is tighter than maybe prior to COVID?
I would say biotech clearly is, since probably the beginning of 2022, biotech funding is infinitely more difficult than it was in the few years before that. these things do go in cycles, and we're in a very deep trough for funding in general. The second thing is biotech, the cycles also, they're different flavors of the month. So in 2021, early 22, really great platform technologies. Ta-da, that's us. Okay, we're really, really hot. Today, what's really, really hot is phase 3 programs that are going to deliver revenues in the next year or two to pharma that, really need those revenues. So we're not the flavor of the month today. Now, the good news is two pieces of good news. Number one is, it's been so clearly amazing technology, transformative technology. People have really treated us outside of that cycle. So we've had no problem raising money, but our stock price is such that it's painful to raise money when all of biotech is way down in a trough. So it's more a matter of, is it the right time to do that as well? And that puts some limits on us. And of course, the second thing we have going for us is these cycles, they've been down for a couple of years, and,
They'll pick back up. Right.
they'll come back up. And the company's not in any difficult position, but like every biotech company today, we have to be very, very careful where we spend our money overall.
And how have you thought about building the company as a result of that? So the thing that you expressed you learned the most from your experience at Rhythm, and even how you were working with your team at Merck, was you have to have these really great people who can be flexible and agile as the organization evolves. Starting a company during COVID, there were a lot of people on the market. There were a lot of rifts. So you probably had a lot of talent to choose from, but also inevitably probably a little bit more risk averse than you might have otherwise been to bring people on. So can you talk about how you chose your team and how you're still thinking about building your team in what's really become the new normal of this, remote company build?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. When we started out this company, one of the learnings I took from Rhythm, which only worked so far at Prime, was, if you have a great idea, you got to run with it. So when we started out, myself, the board, the people who were funding us, came up with the idea of, there's a lot of things happening in gene editing. This really was the best. Now, of course, we're a little biased, but we still even believe that this is the absolute best way to do gene editing, and it's just a major breakthrough. And so the idea was, let's build as fast as we could, carefully but fast, because otherwise there are going to be people coming up behind us who are going to, eat some of our lunch, and let's get out there and to do that. And we did that for about 2 years. And then somewhere around the beginning of 2022, when it became clear the funding situation in biotech was in a slightly different part of the cycle, we kind of plateaued to a little bit. So I'm not thrilled about that. We really should be building today. I'm talking about conceptually, not practically. But there's no point even talking about that today. We have to really make do with what we have until we get lots of data that's going to convince people this really is, truly as amazing as we think. And I expect in a couple of years, we'll take that trajectory back up again. Putting the people together was complex. One thing that we had going for us is that this technology created a great splash. People read about it. It was picked up by laboratories all over the world. Literally thousands of laboratories are using it. There have been a couple hundred papers. So people were really excited about it. And since a lot of our work is scientists, sometimes, practical scientists, more like engineers, and sometimes pure research scientists, people knew all about it. And frankly, people were fighting for the opportunity to work at a place like Prime, which was a wonderful thing for us. We got a chance to look over some great people. And frankly, most of those people are still with us. We've been lucky this year to have, what we call attrition. The number of people who leave, is minuscule. And the ones who leave, because, against our, with regrets, because every once in a while someone will work out, is even smaller still. I don't know if that'll continue, but it's really nice to work with something that the field really recognizes as special. And in fact, one of our founders, David Liu, was awarded an outstanding scientist award, the biggest achievement award at ASCGT, a major genetic conference just last month. It's it just recognizes just how special this gene editing approach would be. So that really helped us a little bit. Same thing was true with my leadership team. When I brought those people in, what I had to do is sell them on a vision of the company. Now that vision has changed a little bit over time, but it was, you guys are at the forefront of medical knowledge. This is going to be a linchpin of therapeutics and become one over the next decade. Do you want to be part of it or not? I had to tell them it's going to be a wild ride, because there's so many things we're learning. I joke that you're on a bucking bronco, a horse, and you're just going to have to hang on tight with the rest of us. And, if you want to come in every day and know exactly what you're going to be doing for the next month, go back to Merck, okay? Because that's where you can do that kind of thing. If you come here, you're going to be ready for the fact that things are going to change, exciting things, hopefully, and that's important. And then I also set certain boundaries on our culture. It's very collaborative. It's very open-ended, very sharing of things. So we decided a way we were going to work together. And, I told people, these are things you have to agree with. And frankly, if you don't agree with them or you don't practice them when you get here, you're not going to be able to stay. And, we worked hard to weed out people who, for whatever reason, that wasn't their style of working. And I think we've got an incredibly intelligent, fast-moving, very creative bunch of people who are really leading the company with me. And I do like to believe I have the same characteristics as well. But I will say I know that I have them in my team because I really got a chance to evaluate them.
I'm sure that's true. And I think it's also a great tell of an amazing leader when you see it in your team and you build great teams that impress you and complement the skills that you bring to the table. So, Keith, thank you so much for the great conversation. It's incredible to hear how you've evolved your career, but learned from the early innovation, brought that to where you are now, and really how you've built a really thoughtful and agile and collaborative team to make something special at Prime. Very much looking forward to hearing how things go with your IND next year.
Thank you very much. Well, this IND we have, now we're talking about our second one next year. I just don't want any confusion about that.
Absolutely.
No, but it's just been a pleasure. You guys asked wonderful questions, and I hope this will be useful to your listeners. So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Keith.
Thank you very much for your time. Great conversation. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Emerging Biotech Leader, an SSI strategy podcast. Join us each month for more conversations with biotech leaders. If you'd like to help navigating the complexities of biotech, reach out to our team at ssistrategy.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review.